Out here this morning. We appreciate your braving the potential rain, although I did see blue sky on the way over here, so I think that's what we're in for. We really appreciate your joining us to view this exhibit and to try some of the staple foods from the Civil War era. You're going to be delighted when you get to the food table over here, because Debbie Steph has put together hardtack, stew, cornbread, and other goodies that would have been what people would have had during this time period. So I think you'll have a really good time with that. I'd like to recognize members of the board of directors for the Friends of the History Center. Will you guys wave? Stand up. Okay, thank you so much. Now, this exhibit was chosen to commemorate the sesquicentennial was the end of the Civil War. So 2015 marked 150 years since the devastating conflict was over. The Education Committee who worked on this, everybody wave your hand if you were on that, a big effort by members of the Education Committee, worked to illustrate what happened during that era in our county, okay? So often the history of the Civil War is focused on the East Coast, and we wanted to bring the story home because that's our mission, relating the history of Aransas County. Please note, I hope everybody got or will get a program, because on that program you have an introduction to the exhibit inside, a good history lesson for you, and on the back you have programs that are coming up, as well as special recognition for the people who have contributed items that are on display in here. I want you to make note of that. And also I want to note the Margaret Sue Rust Foundation, who funded the work that was done, the work that had to be done out of house on the exhibit. So we really appreciate that. The Margaret Sue Rust Foundation also funded our Curation Center, which is behind us here in the garage annex, and the landscaping that's going on for a wildscape, okay? And Pat Garland and members of the Master Naturalist have been working on that garden, and they donated over 100 plants to be put in there. So this was work that was done just last week, and we really appreciate that. We also want to thank the Texas Historical Foundation and the Marguerite Sellers Foundation, because they also contributed to our Curation Center, and it's really going to be a place that people can bring objects to be preserved and taken care of over the years. We hope you're going to attend some of the programs that we're going to have in conjunction with this exhibit. Mike Paul has written a book called A Young Man's Journal of Life and Times During the Civil War, and he'll talk on November 7th. And then on December 12th, Andy Hall will come from Galveston and talk about blockade runners. It's going to be really interesting. We also hope that you'll put on your calendar the tour of historic homes. It'll be December 5th and 6th, where you'll have 7 unique venues with costume docents. But at this time, I'm pleased to introduce Sue Hastings, who will make remarks about the Civil War era in Aransas County. As most of you know, I think, Sue is co-author of Aransas, A Life of a Texas Coastal Community. She spent 2 years researching and collecting the anecdotal information on this area for that book. And more recently, Sue was a co-author of The Rising Tide, about the Jackson maritime business. Please join me in welcoming Sue. Just in case y'all weren't awake.
Good morning. How close to my mouth do I need to put this? All right. Aransas' involvement in the Civil War began much earlier and was much more subtle than one might imagine. 15 years before the Civil War, when Aransas was still technically a part of Mexico, key elements were settling into place. On July 4th, 1845, Texas had elected to become a part of the United States. Just 3 weeks later, American Army troops arrived at the Aransas Pass, where General Zachary Taylor ordered an American flag to be planted in San Jose sand. Taylor then crossed the bay and offloaded horses at the Rocky Point, which would later give its name to the growing community of Rockport. Taylor's men settled in around a large oak tree half a mile inland of the Rocky Point. The troops included these names that you surely recognize: Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Sherman, Jeff Davis, Philip Sheridan, Stonewall Jackson, and so on. All were then young graduates of West Point, intent upon proving their worth. Their aim was to unequivocally free Texas from Mexico and make it a part of the United States. During that struggle, they would learn from each other, and of course, they would learn about each other. Though they could not know it then, personal information about quirks and habits, ways of setting up battle lines and strategies would serve them well when, some 15 years later, they faced each other in the war between the states. Aransas felt far removed from arguments about slavery, at least in the beginning. In 1850, the population of Aransas Refugio was 288 white, 19 slaves. The numbers shot up as new settlers arrived, often bringing slaves with them. Still, few individuals owned many slaves, not by the standards of the Deep South. By 1860, the Refugio County Census, with Aransas as a part of that county, registered a population of 1,680 whites and 209 blacks. And they owned 10 times, the number of whites had quintupled in 10 years, and they owned 10 times as many slaves. Will Duke's father was an Arab, while his mother, Emily Jones, was African. Will married Caroline Johnson, who worked for the Johnsons at Lamar, where they provided her with some education. Thornton Williams that's interesting, married a half-breed Indian who became a medicine squaw. Of course, all these people had their own viewpoints, memories, and traditions to share in the mix that made up Aransas. In 1861, Victor Brock reported that the Texas Negroes, almost without exception, were well treated. Aside from the thought of perpetual slavery, their lot is undoubtedly far better than that of many servants and most factory workers in Europe. Mary Ann Hurd McRae, whose family had come to Texas from Alabama, now just had Aunt Phoebe, an old slave who had been with her since she was a baby. Back in Alabama, Mary Ann had seen herself as a benefactor to her father's 100 blacks. She did not think of them as slaves, just the Negroes. Mary Ann wrote, "I would go around and see if the little ones were in need of any clothes. If so, I would get all my old dresses and make little dresses out of them." She also made quilts for the older slaves so that her father need buy only one quilt for each of them. As threats of a war between the states simmered, the governor of Massachusetts reminded the U.S. government that it had virtually bought Texas after the war. Almost before anyone could blink, troops were protecting key points along Texas's long line of barrier islands, and just in time. By the end of the year, the first units of a federal blockading squadron appeared off the Aransas Pass. Union Captain Neal's companies were indifferent to the needs of the inhabitants of San Jose Island, who were trying to save their property and escape. Peter Johnson Jr. was only 4 years old then, but he wrote later that his family's life on San Jose became unbearable and extremely dangerous. Ships shelled the little St. Joseph settlement from a distance of 3 miles, he remembered. After one particularly fierce bombardment, almost everyone decided to abandon their islands' homes and go to the mainland for safety. The settlers left as best they could, leaving all their stock and their homes at the mercy of the enemy. In no time at all, 50 federal Marines landed near the abandoned houses and wreaked havoc, according to young Peter. They burned many of the buildings, and what they did not burn, they demolished. The great station house of Captain Peter Johnson disappeared in this work of destruction. The Marines remained on San Jose for several days, and Union Major Forshee polished his plan for destroying the lighthouse at Aransas. Of all the San Jose settlers, only Hannah Brundrick Gaston, and I'm so glad that she could be with me today. I really need her support for this. I hope she's a little taller. Only Hannah Brundrick Gaston remained in her home on San Jose, even after federal officers commandeered it for their quarters. The men were friendly enough, holding Hannah's daughters on their knees, entertaining the girls and giving them candy. But Hannah knew well that Yankees were destroying the ranches and killing livestock. She was about 25 at the time, so she saddled up her horse, rode north along San Jose, then waded neck deep across the Cedar Bayou Channel to warn the Hawes family and the men in the Confederate installation that the Yankees were coming. Federal officers appeared off Lamar in February 1862 to keep Murdoch McRae's ship, Belle of Lamar, out of federal hands. Confederates set fire to her sails and then sank her. The Yankees shelled boats at anchor, tore up Burns's wharves, raided the warehouses, and destroyed the salt works. As the Yankees departed with all the supplies they could carry, they fired a few last shells into town, setting all the frame and log buildings ablaze. Murdoch McRae was not there to see it. He had gone off to the war, and his pregnant wife, Mary Ann, had returned to her family's home in Mission Valley. There, Mary Ann found that the technique of spinning came back to her again. As a young girl, she had found it very hard that her father expected her to make cloth, even though he had slaves to do the work. When she complained, her father had regularly said, "Daughter, if you never have it to do, you will never know how to have it done." Also, all play and no work made Jack go without a shirt. In the difficult days of the war, Mary Ann acknowledged that this was a true saying. She spun and wove cloth to clothe herself and her child, and she sent her soldier, Murdoch, a suit. She had another ready for him when he returned home. On April 22nd, one day after the San Jacinto Day anniversary, Federal Commander Kittredge adopted one of Lafitte's old tricks. He used 2 launches to enter the bay through Cedar Bayou, past Lamar, and ran the length of Aransas Bay, more than 20 miles, to attack 3 blockade runners near the Shellbank Fort. Kittredge put his prisoners in irons and looked toward the Aransas Pass. He saw no reason why he could not sail the captured sloops out into the Gulf under the very noses of the Confederates. But word reached Confederate forces in time. They stopped Kittredge short of his goal. He tried to escape through Blind Pass, but the launches ran aground. The Yankees abandoned them too and ran across the dunes, pursued by Confederates. They managed to wade out into the Gulf, where launches from a Yankee ship waited to rescue them. By the end of May, all of Texas was under martial law. The Confederacy took over everything: the salt works, the postal service, the flow of supplies. Many more men of Aransas enlisted, including Domingo Amaro, a Karankawa Indian boy, who with his sister had lived for a while with James Power at his Live Oak Point home. Federal blockades halted maritime commerce. At first, county court officials provided rations based on the number of mouths to feed. When that distribution process became onerous, the court decided to give money instead. As money depreciated, the court went back to giving rations again. Cloth was in short supply. The state penitentiary became a manufacturing plant, but most of the citizens didn't have money to pay for a shoestring. Young Lyman Russell devised a loom made of cane. Later he wrote that 2 Negro women with my mother could card and spin the woof and warp pretty fast. And after sizing it and reeling it and putting the warp in the loom, it fell my lot to do the weaving, 10 to 12 yards a day, something like 1,000 yards of homespun overall. By July, pecan and oak bark dyed the cloth in shades of tan. Blue came from wild indigo plants, yellow from copperas, and green from mixing copperas and indigo. By July of 1862, all passes between Aransas Bay and Corpus Christi Bay were blocked, and Aransas Bay belonged to the Yankees. At Corpus Christi, Rosalie Hart Prior and her husband fed Confederate cavalrymen. Rosalie Hart had arrived at the Aransas Pass as a small Irish girl in James Power's colony. She lost her father to typhoid just as they landed at the far reach of Pocono Bay. And now this war. Surely Rosalie sighed and thought of Ireland. By the way, her son was the hunting guide described in the book A Man from Corpus Christi, which I think most of you are familiar with. In February 1864, Federals again assailed Lamar. Henrietta Little wrote of her fear as Yankees raided her home and others, taking the meager stores of coffee and tea. We did not care for ourselves, but we felt sorry for our poor mother. There was no flour either. We had to eat cornbread, which we did not relish. We had no lamp oil. We had a sardine can in which we put melted grease with a rag sticking up in one corner. That was all the light we had, which indeed was very poor. By the beginning of 1865, the Refugio County Court was having great difficulty finding anyone to haul breadstuffs from the Brazos and Colorado rivers. George Brundrick Jr. of Colonel Hobby's regiment saw that as a good opportunity to check on his family at Aransas, so he volunteered. Murdoch McRae served the Confederate Army as a boatman for a schooner working the channel between Galveston and Bolivar. It brought supplies to families of soldiers and returned with plantation corn for the Army. Then Murdoch began to bleed from the lungs and was furloughed. But he had not yet left the fort on April the 8th, so he was the first man to read signals from a New Orleans dispatch boat. At Appomattox, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. And those two men had been buddies under an Aransas oak in 1841. The McRae house did survive the war, as did the Peter Johnson home, James Burns warehouse, and the Stella Morris Chapel, built years before by slaves and townspeople working together. After the war, a small community of freed slaves formed in the Blackjacks. Most adopted the last names of their former owners. Whites and blacks found each other after long absences and embraced, remembering happier childhood days. Some blacks begged former owners to take them back, but of course that was impossible for bankrupt landowners. A new Aransas was waiting to be born. There, Peter Johnson, grown old, would sit on his porch at Lamar, look out across the bay, and raise a fist. "Damn Yankees," he muttered. "Damn Yankees."
Thank you so much, Sue. Well, we hope that you will have some refreshments, which Debbie and Jackie and Lucretia brought, and then enjoy reading some more about the exhibit. Thank you so much for being here today.